Welcome to section 3, the Shadoe DOM. If we go to the MDN site and look at what the Shadoe DOM is, it's basically a way of encapsulating web components, so that, for example, one of the most important things is that any CSS styles in the web component don't actually bleed out and affect styling on the rest of the page. But also encapsulation means behaviors, elements can all be encapsulated, and there are rules between passing properties and styles from the outside the light DOM into the Shadoe DOM. We'll explore that as we go through the course. So if we now go to 03 Shadoe DOM, shadowedom.html, we'll just open this up. We can see here in a picture, but as well when we go to F12 and into our elements, that what we're basically doing here is creating what's called the Shadoe DOM. So if we look at my component here, we can see here shadow root, and we can also see, if we look at the page here where we see the slot text here, we can actually see that what's in between the component in the slot API is actually on the boundary of the shadow of the light DOM and the Shadoe DOM. So it gets projected, actually, shall we say, here into the slot content. If we click text reveal, that's the content there. So this is the slot. So if we have a look at the code now of basically creating a fully encapsulated web component, we can use the styling as before. And remember, we've got a section in 04 that goes through all the styling rules and how to do it from the outside and inside, etc. So for now, we'll just focus on, as usual, creating our component, my component, that's its tag name. We use the constructor function. And now this time we attach what's called the shadow root, which is what we've seen here. We've seen here that basically this is this shadow root. And what happens is, to do this, we attach shadow root mode open, which means that JavaScript from the outside can actually interact with it. You can have it closed, which is of no use if you're developing web components, because you actually want to access things inside the web component and expose things. And also it's not fully secure when closed, because you can go backdoor routes with JavaScript to it. So for now, the structure of making our kind of standard web component that's fully encapsulated uses this shadow root. And as you can see here on my shadow root, I'm now putting in the inner HTML, the styles and the content here. And we also have this slot holder, which we'll go into shortly. We use our connected callback as usual. And just to show that we can access things in the light DOM here, we can see that. And basically we now have our web component here, the slot text here. This is the output. It's exactly the same as we've seen before. The difference being is that the styles within it won't bleed out and it's fully encapsulated. So this is it here, and the shadow root and the slot text is here with text reveal. So this is now a fully kind of isolated web component. And as we work through the rest of the lectures, we'll see basically how we can start to use web components for our applications. Now, for example, if we go to Shadoe DOM-template, what we can see is we're using this sort of structure here of a template. And we can now append it to our shadow root. And the formula is template.content.clone node true, meaning it makes a deep copy rather than just the top level. So with that there now, if we want to use a kind of template structure, this is how we will create this component. And if we see it live, here we see it pasted in this area. These shadowy areas are just the web components for demonstration purposes. So now we must look at the slot component. And the slot is basically what we can consider is anything in between here. We can see two examples. Here we're reusing my card, one with slot and one not. And what we can do in the web component itself is actually kind of create default text. So here we're using the same one we did before, and we've got our slot context here. We can see we can style it in a certain way, and we're going to look at how we can style the slot with CSS in slightly more advanced ways later on in 04. But what we can see here, for example, is we've got default text to be displayed if there is nothing there. So that's a default text, but if we do have something in between, it will display that instead. So once again, if we look at this here, the default slot will be displayed here. This will just show our slot text here, and we can see that hello world from template. Is that the right one? 03. Open this up. 03 default slot. This is the slot text. The slot text in here is default text in template will be rendered. Let's just open this up. There it is. My apologies, wrong page. There we can see it. This is the slot text in a card, and here is default text if there is nothing in that slot. And we'll be looking now. We can also create name slots. So for example, in this example here, 04 with a card, we're actually giving each of these slots a different name, which means down here in our web component on the web page, we can actually then link up to its name with the exact text. And so it means, therefore, if you notice the order here is email first title, up here it's first title email. The order in here in the actual web component doesn't matter. This information will be put in the right slot. So if we open this up, go to Open Live Server, there we can see we have our card, and therefore this would enable a user or anyone who wants to, when they're doing this card, to basically put child elements within inside a card, and it would then be projected into the right place into our web component. So this is another way, other than attributes here, if we want to provide props through the children, as it were, we can then use that slot to pass in data for the web component. So that's another avenue into the web components. There is also a slot changed API, which we can see down here. And one thing I will point out is, if you notice here, there are some CSS rules that just focus on the slotted element. We'll go into that in the CSS section, but we can highlight by slot. And there's been a lot of work with web components to make styling at the enterprise level easier to use within components, and to avoid conflicts and to avoid duplication. So we can see here in this example here, we have our card, we have the slot, name equals first. And if we open up this one here, this slot is the unnamed text, this slot is the first in that component. And we have the slot change. If you notice here, we can loop through the slots. So if we go to F12 again and look at the console, we can see how things are spat out. And one thing I will point out is that when you're in the slot, spaces and character returns are actual nodes in their own right. So when you're going through here, if in the slot text, for example, let's go down here. If we change this and kind of do character return space like this, and now have a look at it, we will see we're kind of getting spans, we're getting all sorts of different, we're getting the text div, we're getting different things come out of the slot. So that's why we don't tend to necessarily use the slot API in this access to get access to information here, because if somebody times it with a character, this will now be the second element rather than the first when it was in its original way. So the slot API, more advanced, maybe not necessarily really used, but it is available. And if we look at MDN, and if we search for the slot API, and remember this is an HTML specification, we can come into the slot. There we go. And I think if we do further searching, we can find out all the APIs. So let's just maybe quickly have a look for on Google. Go for Google slot API. Yeah, you can see you get the assigned nodes, assigned elements, the slot change event. Here an example of it. So you can see element in slot. If you want to actually get what's in the slot for your application, you can, but bear in mind that depending on how your client uses it, it depends whether it's you or somebody else, putting character spaces or new lines are treated as actual nodes and therefore appear in the slot array. So in a sense, if we go back into the Shadoe DOM and just have a look again at what we're actually seeing here, is the concept of the Shadoe DOM is that actually it's a separate fragment that gets flattened with the DOM tree once it's rendered. It has slot API, and notice here that this text here is on the boundary, although it's in the web component, it's on the boundary of the web component, the Shadoe DOM and the light DOM, and it sort of gets projected in. So when we're styling, for example, as we'll see in the next section, we can then basically see that actually we have access to this from sort of almost like the light DOM directly. So that's the Shadoe DOM, full encapsulation, isolates it. There are rules to pass, say, styles through it. And when we look at the event section, we're going to then look at and see how we can actually communicate between the Light DOM and the Shadoe DOM, and how we can communicate between different components on a page, which is, for those that know JS frameworks, is props down, events up. And we'll look at that because that will then lead into actually how we can actually make our application in our library and start seeing it really working. So that's the Shadoe DOM for web components.